Hello, and welcome back to PTE tutorials. Today we'll be going over the Pearson Test of English academic reading section, specifically on questions about how to reorder paragraphs. The content of this presentation will include our reordering the paragraph intro, test instructions, scoring, and examples. First, let's begin by explaining exactly what reordering the paragraph. This is a reading question type in which one has to arrange the sentences in a single correct order, such as the arrangement forms, into a meaningful paragraph. It's basically here to assess your ability to comprehend the organization and cohesion of a given text. Here is exactly what you will see when you encounter such a problem. The text boxes in the left panel have been placed in a random order. Restore the original order by dragging the text boxes from the left panel to the right panel. Drag the source box to the target panel. You will be graded based on partial credit. If all the sentences are arranged in the correct order, then a total grade will be awarded. Else, if one or more sentences are in an incorrect order, partial grading applies based upon how well you organized the rest of the sentences. The reading skills that are required for these kinds of problems are identifying the main idea and keywords. You need to identify what the key phrases are, what the logic is, and what the topic is. From there, you can identify the relationship between each and every sentence and put them together in a logical manner. You can try to identify the general and introductory sentence with the central idea. This is because that kind of a sentence would be your topic sentence, and that would generally go first. You also need to comprehend the logical or chronological sequence of the sentences, looking for dates that go in order or a sequence of events that will go in order. You also need to comprehend the implicit and explicit information stated. There may be things that are implied in these sentences, and there may be things that are explicitly stated. This kind of information will help you determine whether or not things should go in what order. Now let's go over a step-by-step strategy on how to tackle these problems. First, skim all of the sentences carefully. Make sure you can identify the main idea and perhaps the introductory sentence of the sentences. Try to identify a relationship between the sentences. Start looking and deciding whether or not this sentence makes sense going before or after the sentence prior to it. Concentrate on the ending of the sentence in order to try and identify the next sentence. There may be a transition between two different sentences that will allow you to determine which sentence comes next. Also, follow the grammatical relationships. Nouns are generally replaced by pronouns later on in a paragraph, and an indefinite article generally precedes a definite article before a noun. Also, concentrate on those transitional phrases. See if there's any obvious ones that tell you which sentence will come next. Finally, arrange all the sentences and then read the text out loud or in your head to yourself to identify which ones are out of place, if they are out of place. Here's a sample question. Education and vocational skills can also affect the placement of prisoners. Some prisons provide vocational training for the inmates who want training to receive it. Now, can also seems to imply that this is not going to be the first sentence. Usually the allocation of prisoners is decided by the Department of Prison Administration. In case of habitual criminals and young offenders, the decision is made by the prison court. Usually implies that there was some other topic that was generally preceding this in order to bring this one up. What about the reason for imprisonment? Generally, serious offenders and recent escaped ones are kept in closed institutions for security reasons. The inmates convicted for minor crimes are more likely to be held in open institutions. This sentence seems to imply that it's answering a question that is not answered in prior sentences. The age and sex of prisoners is also important because there is a juvenile prison for young offenders and women who are confined in a separate institution. The ones who have problems with health go to the prisons with hospital sections or to a prison hospital or prison mental hospital. Also important seems to imply that this is after another sentence that explains things. An important factor in placement of prisoners are his or her recidivism. There is an idea to keep habitual criminals separate from first offenders, but it might not be an absolute rule. Now this seems to imply that this is not the first sentence and that there's still another sentence after all. However, looking at these overall seems to imply that there is no topic sentence, so we have to think a little bit harder. Sometimes the questions will be more obvious as to which one is the topic sentence. So judging from what we have, I would say that E is our first one. And I would say this because this is the most general of all the sentences. From there, I would also say that our next question, or our next answer, is going to be the age and sex of prisoners is also important, because it links between important and also important. Can also seems to be the next question, so I'll put that as number 3. Now, after number A, this seems like an interesting thing to have, because what about the reason for imprisonment? Each of these sentences beforehand has talked about the different reasons for each of these sentences has talked about how everyone will be placed, but nobody talks about the reason for placement. So I would argue that C comes at number 4, because it talks about the reason for imprisonment. Lastly, I would say that B is going to be our 5th one, because it talks about how the prisoners are going to be allocated. Checking our answers, we see that this is correct. Important factor in placement of a prisoner is his or her recidivism. There is an idea to keep habitual criminals separate from first offenders, but it might not be an absolute rule. The sex and age of prisoners. The age and sex of prisoners is also important because there is a juvenile prison for young offenders and women are confined in a separate institution. The ones who have problems with health go to the prisons with hospital section or to prison hospital or mental prison hospital. Education and vocational skills can also affect the placement of prisoners, since prisons provide vocational training for the inmates who want training or need it. Now you can insert, but what about the reason for imprisonment? Generally, serious offenders and recently escaped ones are kept in closed institutions for security reasons. And then finally, usually the allocations of prisoners are decided by the Department of Prison Administration. I hope that you found this video useful, and we look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial from PTE Tutorials.